5. Into the High Cloud Court. The 60th day of mourning passed with my family standing on the fields that had hosted Kogo Noraline's funeral pyre and releasing the matured nymphs into the sky. All of Arashi gathered into the courtyard of Storm's Keep, on the side closest to the fields. So many people had gathered, they had spilled out of the castle gates and filled the surrounding streets as they waited and watched. The cloud of slender nymphs rose, the nymphs fully transformed, lifting with their delicate, iridescent wings to fill the sky and begin their journey into their next life. The final rite symbolized my mother's passing into her next life. Had she come to death naturally, the rite would have celebrated her life and released her into the empire beyond to take her rightful place with the gods. Alas, with her life curtailed early, she would be reborn and walk amongst the Nantai people once again. Or so was our belief. The people drank and danced in the streets well into the dark hours, and on the morning after, we stored away our mourning clothes and looked toward happier times. For me, albeit sweet, the day also felt bitter. I'd endured enough mourning for a lifetime, but I had no time to grieve over the loss of Jessa, as it was time to turn toward my other dilemma, rising to serve our people as political tradition demanded, or following my heart and leaving the jewel city of Arashi behind, in search of why the stones about my neck sang to me. Overnight, the High Cloud Court had moved into the sky above Storm's Keep, and government affairs would dominate my immediate days ahead. On the uppermost roof of Storm's Keep Castle, alongside my father's counselors, my sisters and their first advisors, the Triad, the Lajja, and a few of his selected guardsmen, I awaited the arrival of the Cloud Courtiers to escort us into court. As the stairs coming down from the cloud formed in slow motion, I searched for Nadia and Corwine, determined not to ascend into the courts without my first advisor at my side. Careen and Imrizel stood close, offering advice on how to handle myself while at the High Cloud Court. "You should show only strength at all times," said Imrizel, an airy or haughty note to her words. "Cloud courtiers, illusionists that they are, will play games of deception," added Careen. Having been too young to attend the courts the last time my father had gone, I entered new territory that day, along with having to accept the mantle of the people. I looked from my eldest sister to Yasmin, who gave me a smile charged with excitement, then on to the Lajja. He stood to the side, stone-faced. Something about his at-ease manner told me he was anything but easy with this situation. To him, I dipped my head, acknowledging his tightly held concern, and I looked across the roof again for Nadia. The billowing clouds met the roof's surface, and a group of 8 courtiers descended 2 at a time, their shoulders held back and heads high, each more striking than the one before, yet all somehow alike. They, too, seemed to waft and curl and billow as they walked, and there were no features by which I could discern who might be who. Imrizel leaned close to my ear and in her husky voice whispered, "The only way you will know a cloud courtier is by the emblem they wear on their shoulders. Each is unique, so as they introduce themselves, take note of their symbols." Careen said into my other ear, "Never forget, you are their empress, receiving your subjects. If you slip, they will take advantage." The cloud courtier cast's opportunistic nature I felt well prepared to handle, but the resentment at my sister's need to constantly remind me of such things crawled beneath my skin. Her anger that father had named me successor bled through in the sharp commands she disguised as advice. This situation weighed upon me, but as well as I knew the nature of the cloud courtiers, I knew Careen's nature even better. Confronting her on that matter would do little to help, and in truth, she might see it as an insult and retreat from our sisterhood altogether. In this time, I couldn't afford to chase away someone who stood at my side in spite of her own umbrage. The first 2 cloud courtiers approached, mist swirling at their feet. Their skin glimmered as if someone had dusted it with a metallic powder. Their lashes reminded me of branches after a snowstorm. The first one bowed in front of me. "A glorious morn to you and yours, my lady Mairynne Evangale. I am Ryū Wars, and my companion is Alto Raal. I remember you as a youngling, and you have grown well into the Evangale charm." Intrigued, I regarded the courtier, taking note of the crescent moon shape on the shoulder. Much must have shown on my face, because with the flourish of a hand, the image before me changed. I looked upon the visage of a boy, one whom I remembered, a boy I'd considered a friend, and who visited our castle from time to time when I'd been a child. "Viordine?" I asked. His hand reversed the flourish, and he returned to the glittering, genderless apparition who'd been there before. "The one and only, Lady Mairynne," answered Ryū Wars. "I have grown and gained my majority, as have you. Are you and your council ready to ascend?" My chest tightened at the word, the double meaning heavy on my soul. Scanning the rooftop again and not finding my aunt, I said, "We are not. I await one more. You will forgive the delay." I motioned to the clergy, beckoning. Tasmin answered my call, leaning in as I asked her to send an acolyte in search of my aunt. In delicate silence, we waited. When Nadia finally appeared, she didn't wear clothing appropriate for court. She hadn't combed her hair, and deep purple circles shadowed her eyes. She rushed over and threw her arms around me. "Mairynne, I am so very sorry." Her voice sounded broken and quivering in my ear. When she pulled back, I could see tears threatening to overflow. She glanced furtively at the people who surrounded her, and her throat worked. But whatever had her so worked up had also stolen her words. Solarine Donsgala stepped forward from where the counselor stood and placed a gentle hand on my aunt's back. "What is it, Nadia? Will you tell us what has happened?" Nadia shook her head and scrubbed at her face as the tears fell. When she collected herself enough to speak, she said, "It's Corwine. He's very ill. He's been sick all night and is resting now. I have to get back. I'm sorry, Mairynne, but I cannot attend with you today." "Nadia, it will be fine," I said, but wondered exactly how it would. Solarine said, "I'll come with you to care for him." "No." My voice cracked on the harsh word, but I'd found my command. I hadn't intended to seem cold, but I had need of my supporters. "I, too, am sorry, Nadia. You may return to your partner, but I need Solarine at my side. Tasmin, you will send an acolyte to fetch the physicians and tend to Corwine until we return." I raised my voice then, looking around at the stunned faces of storm sorcerers and cloud courtiers alike. "Everyone else will continue to the High Cloud Court as planned." "Yes, Lady Mairynne." Tasmin motioned over a young man and set him to the errand. Solarine turned a hard look to me as I made these decrees, but her eyes shone with her comprehension. She would attend to the duties she'd accepted by being part of the royal council. I gave a single nod and hugged my aunt. "Go, see to your companion, and I'll do what I can here." When she had departed, Lucas Thundergala stepped forward. "Lady Mairynne, if you'll allow, I can act as your first advisor for the purposes of ascension." Solarine's eyes dodged mine. Seeing further that she felt herself not up to the task, I accepted Lucas's offer and worked to suppress my worry over Corwine, someone who'd been a part of my life for enough years that I considered him family, an uncle. I'd be just in deferring the meetings in light of an ill family member, but my presence there wouldn't help. Responsibility for Corwine's recovery rested with our physicians. With a deep breath and false confidence, I turned back to the cloud courtiers. I didn't relish the thought of accepting these responsibilities without Nadia at my side, but duty stood before me, a duty which I didn't intend to neglect that day. I am empress, I reminded myself, receiving my subjects. To Ryū Wars, I said, "We are ready." As the procession went, a pair of the cloud courtiers led the way up the misty stairs. The Laja and 3 of his soldiers followed, and I climbed somewhere in the middle with Lucas at my side. When we crested, arriving at the large yard before the series of castles in the clouds, my interim first advisor leaned in. "The central castle is where we hold royal court. The smaller courts are there to the right, the royal quarters to the left," he said. Though I felt grateful for his guidance, I found myself more concerned with the courtiers present for our arrival and a sense of tension that erupted around the Storm's Keep guards and Pelagia. As I watched, he stood rigidly with his feet apart and staggered. His hands crept toward the handles of his scimitines. I rested a hand on Lucas's forearm and went toward the commotion. Mairynne and Evangale fell into step beside me. "What has happened?" I asked. "Lady Mairynne," said Evangale, "it seems that one of the courtiers has put your guards on alert with some ill words referring to their captain." "Sister," Mairynne added, "it would be best if you were the one to call halt to the matter." In agreement, I moved faster, calling the wind to speed my step. When I arrived, one of the silver-dusted beauties spread arms wide, and I caught the edge of his words. "But 'tis truth that you exist outside the castes, is it not? Blood of the highest order contaminated by the fourth would traditionally be offered up to the Sinti. Is that not so?" "Enough!" I snapped. Silence fell again, and all eyes turned. The Laja shot me a warning look, making his desire that I remain uninvolved clear, though I also detected an exacerbation, suggesting what he wouldn't voice. "I told you as much." Breathing slowly to manage my nerves, I reminded myself, I am empress, receiving my subjects. To the offender, I said, "May I have your name?" The cloud courtier turned to me and sank into a bow. "I am called Alto Trea, my Lady Mairynne." Otherwise indiscernible, the emblem on the courtier's shoulder became a calling card. It showed a pattern of wispy swirls, resembling lines of the black swans that swam in the pools at the foot of Sundai Falls. The swan, I decided, and wondered again why they all chose to look so similar. Lifting my chin, I said, "Were you familiar, Alto Trea, with Kogo Noraline's work for the Nantai people? That she worked across castes and with the small folk alike, and that she believed all deserve an equal voice?" I feigned a pause as if to await a reply, but before anyone could make a sound, I continued. "Before you answer, I am certain you are." I smiled, having claimed the upper hand. "As I am my mother's daughter, I shall not tolerate words, no matter how gently spoken, that slander. Is that abundantly clear?" This time, I allowed the courtier to answer. The swan bent at the waist. "As you command, Lady Mairynne." And for all I could discern, the courtier held no emotion or reaction to my order. If animosity existed within, the swan contained it well. In reality, amidst those gathered, every cloud courtier's face seemed solemn, identical. As for the faces of the storm sorcerers in attendance, each told a different story, but all seemed proud of the stance I'd taken. Mairynne outright smiled, and Evangale nodded once with her approval. Despite the vote of confidence, I was ready to be out of the spotlight, if only for a brief time. "Now," I started, "I understand the first of our proceedings will be this evening. I'd like to freshen up before then. Alto Trea, as you have so eagerly welcomed my party, you will kindly show us to the royal quarters." I held the swan's icy gaze. "Naturally, Lady Mairynne." The courtier's manner remained poised, and I still perceived no emotion as we followed. The feeling was like nothing I'd ever experienced. It was as if I were dealing with animated dolls. Hopefully, Lucas would have some wise counsel as we took repast for the afternoon. I understood now that I'd met cloud courtiers before, but my past experience with the person I'd known as Viordine had failed to prepare me for this. Inside the royal chambers, Lucas thanked Alto Trea and closed us inside, away from the courtiers. Our rooms provided ample space for all in attendance, private apartments surrounding a common area for meals and meetings. Walls, floors, even the furniture and linens in light blues, silvers, and whites reflected light and added to the feeling of being in the clouds. I stepped to the balcony, and far below, Stormskeep drifted away as we rose into the sky. Under my feet, I hadn't noticed the movement. The cloud court had already departed its dock. I ran a hand over a stone wall, amazed at how cloud magic made such a solid structure lighter than air. A throat cleared at the door, and I turned to find Thalaja casually leaning to one side at the threshold. "Join me," I said, "and close the door behind you."
"Your display back there was unnecessary."
"I disagree." He smiled, a glint in his eyes saying that mayhap he enjoyed my disagreement by some measure. As the soon-to-be empress, I owed no explanation. But within, a need to voice my reasons drove my agitated speech. That was their first interaction with me as their empress. There wasn't room for leniency. What was said before I arrived? The spark in his eyes went dark.
"That I'll not repeat. You heard enough to get the courtier's point."
He crossed over and leaned on the railing, taking in the scene below, the Stormskeep castle, falls, citadel, and city surrounded by the high wall.
"It looks small from here."
"That it does. Home is a wondrous place," I said idly, resisting the urge to press him more. I had gained their meaning well enough, and hopefully my stance resonated strongly enough.
"You will be back there soon, as Kogo Mairynne Evangale."
I looked into the distance, where the fields and forests spread across Nantai, wondering where our travels would one day take us. Feeling distant myself, I ignored the honorific and said, "For a time." Then, returning to the present and hardening my resolve, I added, "Thalaja, when I have concluded my business at court, I intend to come with you to find my father." Once my father's, and now my protector, Thalaja dropped his shoulders on a sigh, his eyes shifting in an obvious search for the right response. All of his training, every instinct he'd honed to perfection, and his very foundation of being, I had just called into question with my announcement. For all his tactical agility and gallantry, he struggled when facing a proposal with which he disagreed. Mayhap the hesitation hailed from his protective nature. Maybe he felt inadequate given his intermingled bloodlines. The former, I could do little to change. The latter, I would one day see handled, but not while my father lived and could still rule the Nantai people. For now, I watched and waited for his reply. If my plight resulted in success, I'd beg for the decree from the restored emperor. Until then, I had to believe he would grant his youngest daughter's wish. When Thalaja's reply came, it sounded as assured as if he'd known what he'd say all along.
"Lady Mairynne, I am no royal advisor. I have no political knowledge, nor have I an agenda. Combat and covert endeavors are where I excel, and this is no mission for someone born to rule the Nantai people. I beg of you to trust that if he lives, I will find Tenyo Azarine and return him safely to you at Stormskeep."
I reached for my necklace. His words struck me, and, had it not been for the burning stone against my skin, I may have heeded his wisdom. "Thalaja," I said, placing my free hand on his forearm, "this has little to do with how well I trust you to return my father." I gave a single laugh, freely toward the sky at how, in reality, I trusted him more than any other person. With a smile, I added, "That you will be at my side gives me the confidence to make the journey." He pressed his lips tighter. Then quietly he said,
"I can't take you to Umbra."
Glancing toward the door and lowering his voice even more, he went on,
In confidence, I had planned to enter the Evernight Marshes alone. Avoiding the enchantments there requires too much concentration for me to watch over another. Especially you.
What? I began, but he'd stopped my objection before it had really begun. The fact that he'd planned to do all this on his own, despite the guise of taking a team, brought me up short. After a pause to gather my own thoughts, I asked, "But you will return to Stormskeep after, with the totem?"
I will.
"And how do you propose to convince the small folk at Evernight's Heart to part with something so prized?" Thalaja remained silent, telling me no more about what tactics he might use, but by his silence, also that he would bring back the totem at any cost. Of that, I felt assured, and I believed it with as much certainty as I had faith that my father still lived. Whatever he planned didn't leave me feeling easy, but it sufficed, allowing me to imagine the result would be worth the cost, and that no one would come to harm in obtaining this relic. The door creaked, and Lucas stood in the frame, tall, slender, with hands folded in front of him.
"Lady Mairynne, your attendants and your sister have arrived."
His lip curled, and he hesitated on the word sister, like it tasted wrong in his mouth. The feeling seemed typical of the counselor. Yasmin's exuberance scrubbed his cool composure like little else could manage. "Thank you, Lucas," I said, my gaze flitted back to Thalaja. "This is not the end of our conversation." He tipped his head forward, then stood straight and said,
"My team should have searched your rooms for any dangers by now. We will help with the chests, then wait in the outer rooms if you should have need of us."
He passed Lucas, turning to slide through the tight doorway. Lucas stepped aside, but remained square and kept his attention on me. Attention or possible distaste that I hadn't noticed before. With the exception of Mairynne Evangale, my counselors each worked hard to disguise their thoughts and offer advice when needed. But as I spent more time with them, I learned and took note of what their body language said that their words did not. I had little desire to stir conflict within my own retinue here, away from our home, so I allowed the slight to pass. Lucas turned as I went inside. My counselors gathered around a table while Doreen, Thalaja, and his small team moved our chests of clothing on the wind to each of the chambers. Mother Feathergala was in the process of greeting my sister. Karine stooped to return the embrace, and did so eagerly, greeting the woman who had attended to all of us as children. After they parted, the small but lithe woman came to me with open arms. "You seem a bit out of breath," I said as we hugged. She smiled and flipped a hand dismissively. "The air's thinner. Takes more effort to gather the wind from moving around the heavies. But don't you worry. We'll get everything settled. You go about your business." When she moved away, Yasmin appeared in her place, placing both hands on my shoulders. "Mairynne, Nestrine and I will visit Comtesse Sanseri's court on the morrow. She asked that we bring witnesses to vouch for us. Will you come?" She looked nervously between her betrothed and me. My brow felt heavy, not from my sister's request, but at the realization that the Cloud Courtier went by Sanseri rather than one of the factions. Though I wasn't sure there was sufficient time on the morrow, I wanted to serve my sister's wishes. I put on a smile and answered, "Of course, Yasmin." To Lucas, I asked, "Sanseri is a Cloud Courtier, true?"
"She is."
"How is it we know she is she?" I asked, still wondering at my next question regarding the factions.
"Comtesse Sanseri always chooses a feminine form. She believes it better represents all the gentle things about love and affection."
"Oh, Lucas," Azarine Nightingale admonished, "you know there is more substance to it than that." I turned to her, brows raised and waiting to hear more about this more. She continued, "Sanseri believes herself better than the uniform ways of the Cloud Courtiers. Her given name is Siro-san, But when she began the proceedings of Love's court, she dispensed with the faction naming, as well as with the same allusions as the rest of the courtiers.
But do not let that fool you, Mairynne, Imarizel interjected. People across Nantai call her Comtesse of the Mask for good reason.
She arched a black brow over one glinting green eye. Lucas cleared his throat and said,
You will know her by her seat at the center of court. I do believe it is wise for you to visit her court whilst you are here, and as we must travel to the seats of each of the other nobles before ascension, tomorrow is satisfactory.
Turning back to my acting first advisor, I asked, How long will gathering the nobles take? He folded his hands behind his back and paced as he answered.
Traveling by cloud is the quickest route, but it will still take a handful of days to make the circuit to the iced plains in the north, Kodena Kori, the desert's edge, and finally to the barrows.
My hand found the stones around my neck, hot and cold. The cold one burned this time as I spoke. Tell me, Lucas, or anyone. Solarine. She surfaced from her daze and turned to me, but waited. Or Azarine, or Omine. Why have we not invited the small folk, or the Sinti, to the proceedings of the realm? Should not all have a seat on the High Council? And who will speak for the casteless? Omine gasped, a shaky hand covering his mouth. Azarine and Lucas had mirrored expressions, pressing their lips together in an attempt to measure their words. Solarine stood and circled the table toward me.
I am sorry, Mairynne, that I have been wearing my worry over Corwine and offering you little counsel. In this matter, though, even your mother, Kogo Noraline, had trouble finding or convincing any of those peoples to join us.
Lucas found his voice again.
The Sinti live apart from the rest of the Nantai people. We have never been able to locate them at will.
Azarine snapped. And the small folk ward their seats of power heavily. It's too dangerous to try to approach them. And they refuse meetings with us to discuss such matters. She threw a hand up in the air and asked, Bless the Triad. When was the last time we received any of the small folk at Storm's Keep? I looked at her hard. I have noted your point, Azarine. Albeit I cannot recall the last time a Cloud Courtier, Fireforger, Frostfighter, Stonesinger, or Underhill Dweller visited our keep. She shrank under my stare. Karine, I said, would you go to the outer rooms and ask the Laja to return? When he appeared before me, my first guardsman bowed, stood, and awaited the reason for my summons. Gensui Thalaja, I said, when you travel to the small folk of Umbra, you will deliver a message on behalf of the empress. That should be me by the time your meeting comes to pass. Swallowing the sudden lump in my throat, I asked him to extend an open invitation to the leader who held Umbra's seat. When he agreed, I turned my attention to more immediate matters. Now, can someone tell me how to best deal with the oddities of these courtiers? Omine scoffed, then gave a hearty laugh.
Lady Mairynne, if you think the courtiers are your only concern, wait until you meet the other castes who will attend the High Cloud Court of Nobles. These proceedings are, shall we say, quite colorful.
He lifted a mug from the table, drinking deeply with a trail of foam drizzling down his chin. Regarding my rotund counselor, I gnawed at the inside of my lip. At length, I gave a rueful smile, deciding to credit Omine for that bit of wisdom. Well, I said, from my small experience today, it certainly seems that what I have learned of the Nantai peoples in theory may not have been adequate preparation. Of those who attended court on my behalf, only Thalaja agreed to be at my side for Nestrine and Yasmin's assignation at Love's court. My counselors had old acquaintances they wished to see, or things they wished to buy from the cloud markets. Or, in Solarine's case, she wished to remain in solitude and offer prayer to Solène that her brother would be well. Edamine, priest of Atun, spoke for the triad in haughtily stating that neither gods nor clergy attended such proceedings, and excused himself, Tasmin, and Arline. They would retire to Otar's temple until the ascension ceremony itself. 2 cloud courtiers greeted us upon our arrival at Comtesse Sansary's court. They invited Nestrine alone into court, and directed Yasmin, Thalaja, and me to wait in the anteroom, which turned out to be an open-air seating area with several ornately designed settees, each wide enough to seat 2 in close proximity. Mist floated at our feet, obscuring the floor. When the courtiers had left us alone, Yasmin sank slowly onto the closest sofa, looking ghostly and wringing her hands. I went to my sister, laid a hand on her shoulder, and said, "You've no need to worry. Nestrine loves you greatly, and he will show that to the Comtesse." "But Mairynne, why wouldn't she receive us together as a couple?" Her brows peaked as she searched my face for an answer that I could only wish to possess. I shrugged one shoulder but found it hard to hold eye contact when I could offer little to soothe her fears. There is little we can do but wait and see. Thalaja waited for me to sit, then took the place at my side. His solemn look bespoke naught of his thoughts, and the 3 of us remained in silence for quite some time, until worries began to grow in my thoughts as well. Curious about what awaited behind the silver scrollwork doors, I whispered to Thalaja, "Have you been to this court before?" "I have not." He shook his head slowly. "What do you know of the Comtesse Sansary?" I asked. "Very little, Lady Mairynne." He adjusted in his seat, moving one scabbard so he could face me better. "My guidance would be to remain open and calm, observe and listen. If there is something I have learned of people over the years, it is to trust slowly. You never know where you might find an ally or an adversary." The advice embodied the man at my side, and it seemed my best course of action. I vowed to try to do the same, not only at Sansary's court, but for the remainder of our time in the high cloud courts. Time passed, and I made small talk with Yasmin as a means to distract her while we awaited summons. After maybe an hour, the doors opened. At last, Nestrine exited alone through the silvery door. The cloud courtiers standing to either side remained statuesque. Yasmin stood, and he went to her and bowed to one knee, taking her hand in his. "My love and shining light," he started. "I want you day and night." I rolled my eyes and looked at Thalaja, trying not to laugh at the horrid attempt at poetry. A muscle jumped in my guard's jaw, and his eyes widened ever so slightly. Yasmin, conversely, looked lovingly upon the man at her feet. Inhaling deeply, I reminded myself, open and calm, observe and listen, and I worked to keep my expression neutral. "The Comtesse has given me her instruction, and now bids that you appear before her. May I escort you, my Lady Mairynne Evangale?" My sister grinned at me, barely containing excitement that begged for freedom. Then back to Nestrine, she said. "Of course," Nestrine added. "Comtesse Sansary asked that you bring the witnesses before her." He stood and turned expectantly to Thalaja and me. "Will you both join us?" I held out a hand. "Please, lead the way." Thalaja offered me an arm, his brow raised in question. "Observe?" I asked, placing my hand on his forearm. "And listen," he answered. The courtiers at the doors pulled them wide, and we followed the cheerful couple inside. Unlike the royal chambers decor, and in contrast with the whites, silvers, and airy blues that colored the rest of the high cloud courts, vibrant color painted the interior of Sansary's court. Tapestries of red and gold, lively paintings, upholstery in whimsical teal or purple, and silks of yellow and orange. Much smaller than I had expected, the room smelled of incense and spice. Several artists with easels and paints took positions along the outskirts of the room, readying their supplies to capture the scene. Unattended musical instruments rested against the walls. In the place of chairs, pillows lay in a circle, and the person who could only be Sanseri sat on the largest at the far side, with her legs folded and hands palm up on each knee. Her auburn hair flowed in abundant waves, and her skin seemed dusted with gold rather than silver. She smiled serenely, welcoming us to her court. 2 courtiers sat to her left and 2 to her right, all taking a similar feminine form and posed to mirror their leader. One of the 4 said, "Comtesse Sanseri welcomes petitioner Lady Yasmine Evangale and the man who wishes her hand to the center of our circle." Another said, "Likewise, the witnesses, future Kogo Mairynne Evangale and Gensui Thalaja Northern Gala, honor Love's court with their presence." My heart flopped in my chest. I sorely desired to rebut the title, but I dared not. Not yet. Comtesse Sanseri then spoke with a mischievous gleam in her eye and a smirk. "Please, do make yourselves comfortable, and let us enjoy this part of our day." To the courtiers who had allowed them inside, she called, "Bring the artists and musicians, and bring sparkling wine for each of our guests." Yasmine sat in the center of the circle on a lush pillow, Nestrine on the rug at her side. As the other courtiers began to filter in and take up instruments or paintbrushes, Thalaja and I each knelt on pillows to one side, so we could see Sanseri beyond my sister. A courtier appeared, offering a fluted glass filled with a glittery, bubbly wine. After I received mine, she handed the next one to Thalaja. With alacrity, he accepted, but held it before him without a taste. I tipped mine, only enough to wet my tongue, and widened my eyes. Sweet and cool, it tingled in my mouth. Not knowing its possible effects, I then chose to act as Thalaja and hold the glass without partaking. Comtesse Sanseri raised her hands. "Shall we begin?" A commotion, agreement, clapping, and small cheers went up around the room. Sanseri nodded to her left, then right. The musicians began gently playing flutes and strings. With the ambiance established, the Comtesse focused her attention on my sister. "Lady Yasmine, what has this lowly man done to deserve your affection?" Yasmine held her chin high. "Comtesse, Nestrine began courting me before my mother passed." She looked in my direction with a slight smile, then returned her gaze toward the mistress of the court. "My sisters have always said that I have much need of affection, more so than anyone. Nestrine has provided that affection throughout the mourning period." "Future Kogo Mairynne, do you approve of this betrothal?" Her address took me off guard, and I faltered, but recovered quickly with truth. "Comtesse Sanseri, I want naught but happiness for my sister, and I have seen that Nestrine makes her so. I will give my blessing," I answered. "Has he brought you gifts?" she asked of my sister. "He brings me the gift of holding me, of calming my heart and soul, of being close to me when I am in need, and of caring for me as no other can," my sister said, but her head tilted slightly. I couldn't see her face, but I imagined it confused. Our traditions of courtship at Stormskeep involved little in the way of gifting, but everyone from the Siren Sea to the neighboring nation of Yoti had heard rumors of how Sanseri was the true authority on love. I knew in my heart that the reason we sat in the rainbow-colored room was simply because Yasmine craved validation. Sanseri said, "For a love to be fine, your suitor should bring you gifts, and many gifts at that. Has he written you poetry or letters?" Quietly, Yasmine said, "He has not, but—" The Comtesse held up a hand to silence her rebuttal. "These are the foundations of fine love, my lady. How is it you seek my blessing without your betrothed having attended these most basic of matters?" As my sister explained their ongoing relations to her self-appointed judge and jury, I uncomfortably felt the pressure of eyes upon me. Losing track of the official conversation, I scanned the room, attempting to discern between the people who all looked the same, or to see the emblem worn on their left shoulder. A violinist, wrapped in her work, leaned to one side, then the other, as she worked the bow. A painter studied Sanseri and dabbled on the canvas. Most were engaged in their current creations, but at length I found the source of my discomfort. Across the room, a courtier stared harshly at me and Thalaja. She, for the courtiers had all assumed an air of femininity, presumably for Sanseri's good graces, stood angled just enough that I could see the emblem on her shoulder. A swan. Alto Treya. Almost everything about the courtier appeared differently from only a day before, but that emblem marked her, and her stare carried too much disdain to obscure the true person. I leaned toward Thalaja and said, "Remember Alto Treya from our arrival?" He nodded, but confusion tugged his brows together as he peered over to the new image across the court. "It's pretty clear that the swan will be a hard-won ally," I whispered, "if not already an adversary." By way of reply, he said, "As of yet, I would count Alto Treya as neither ally nor adversary. It is hard to know based on a person's prejudices. Some of your counselors hold that very same prejudice." Thalaja, though he believed himself inadequate as more than a guard, once again offered an acute observation. Rendered silent, I stared off with Alto Treya across the room. The courtier broke eye contact first, when Sanseri clapped 3 times to call the room's attention. Once silence had descended, Sanseri made her judgment. "I have heard Nestrine's case for your hand, but this joining has not yet developed sufficiently to deserve blessing from love's court. For 1 year, 1 month, 1 week, and 1 day, Nestrine must practice the ways of fine love. You, Lady Yasmin, will keep his gifts, his letters, his poems, and any art he makes in dedication to you. After this period, you will present a sampling of his finest efforts at this court." She paused for some minor sounds of approval to pass. "Then, and only then, will I be able to bless your union." Outside, I stood with Thalaja and breathed in the unperfumed air, allowing Otar to shine on my face for long, warm moments. I remained uncertain about that in which I had just partaken, but 2 things seemed clearer than before. Sanseri held a power over many of the cloud courtiers that I couldn't describe, one that encouraged them to disguise themselves to her liking alone. And, secondly, I needed more information about Alto Treya. Yasmin and Nestrine joined us, and I turned to my sister. Putting on a jovial smile in hopes of lightening her spirits, I said, "So, it seems we will have a wedding after a year, month, week, and day?" She returned only a thin smile. "It all just appears to be so much work, Mairynne," she said with a note of rejection. I nudged my sister at the thought. "Nay, Nestrine has stood beside you through mourning our mother. We can all see the love he showers on you. This trial will be not for him, and you will be increasingly happy as he gives you more and more affection with each offering Sanseri has prescribed." Yasmin took Nestrine's hand in both of hers. Looking from him back to me, she said, "I suppose you speak the truth. I had just hoped that we could wed sooner." Hugging myself about the waist, I said, "I, for one, am happy for you both, and this will give you ample time to plan for a ceremony to outshine all weddings that have gone before." That thought brought a shining light into her eyes, and she clasped me into a tight hug. I squeezed her back, hoping that it would be long enough, that I would return with father, and that he would be able to see his daughter married properly under the triad.